Hey, everybody. Welcome to Daniel Davis Deep Dive, coming to you live from Washington, D.C. Operational question for today. Is the United States in danger of blundering into a major war, potentially even with Russia, in the Russia-Ukraine war? Now, we have nobody better in the world to try to untangle some of that than the inestimable Doug Macgregor, CEO of our country, our choice, highly decorated combat veteran, and just all around great guy and fan of the show. So, Doug, welcome to the show.
Yeah, happy to be here, Dan.
Man, we have a difficult, well, not a difficult one to untangle, maybe an unpleasant one to untangle, but let's just jump right into it because things are kind of moving in a bad direction here, although I guess they kind of have for a long time, but they seem to be drifting into some new territory that we want to unpack a little bit here. Now, everybody, of course, has been aware that the summer offensive for the Ukraine side this last summer was a complete and unequivocal failure. Now then we're, this big issue toward the end of the year is Zelensky wants more money. Biden wants more money. So far, the Congress hasn't given it because the Republicans are saying, hey, how about our country first? Let's worry about our border and then let's think about that. And nobody wants to give in on anything. So far, no money has come. But the Europeans seem to be growing in some concern. And in fact, the Polish foreign minister has some concerns that he raised just a few days ago.
Now we are holding off an aggressive dictator who is bent on recreating a European empire, a concept whose time has passed. And Ukraine is the internationally recognized victim, recognized by the UN General Assembly. And the consequences of Putin conquering Ukraine would be catastrophic. First of all, of course, for Ukraine, but also for her neighbors, for Europe, and for the whole system of American alliances.
So, wow, the whole system of American alliances is at stake here. And then you had the Swedish Minister of Defense who made an even more alarming statement when he said this.
Många har sagt det före mig, men låt mig göra det med ämbetets kraft, mindre inlindat och med en osminkad tydlighet. Det kan bli krig i Sverige. Vem är du om kriget kommer?
So he's saying after 210 years of peace, all of a sudden now, more than any other time, it's at risk, which gives the implication that, man, Russia must be just forming this big tank army on the border, and there's any day it's just going to start rolling west toward, I don't know, the English Channel. Who knows where they're going to end up heading. But as Kirby said, we don't really have a lot of money to do anything.
Military assistance to Ukraine? I mean, has the well really run dry here, or what does it look like?
We have issued the last drawdown package that we had funding to support, and that's why it's critical that Congress move on that national security supplemental request and we get more funding. The assistance that we provided has now ground to a halt. The attacks that the Russians are conducting are only increasing. And now, as I talked about earlier this week, they're using North Korean ballistic missiles to do their dirty work. So the need is acute right now.
So as we're going to talk about here in just a second, Doug, we'll show momentarily, Russia does seem to be operating on reality. They do seem to be looking on the ground and saying, based on these things that have happened, here's where we're going, which is actually pretty logical from their perspective. But there seems to be a disconnect on the other side, because what doesn't seem to be fitting is you have, whether it's the United States, Sweden, Polish, or the Germans, and we'll show something on that in a second, they seem to be, holy crap, World War III could be coming. Is there any truth to that, Doug?
No. But there are a couple of points that need to be made right up front. I think your use of the word blunder is a very good one. I would argue that certainly since 1991, once we decided that we were invulnerable and invincible and no one could stand against us, we've blundered into all sorts of places. And inevitably, wherever we've gone has been an enormous failure, a catastrophe for both the people living there and for us. So I wouldn't underestimate our capacity for blundering yet again. Now, let's look at the facts in Europe. All of the governments that you highlighted, the German government, the Polish government, the Swedish government, as well as our own, you might as well throw the French and the British into that mix. These are globalist elites. These people are hugely part of the problem. These are the same kinds of people that opened Europe's borders to the influx of millions of people from the Middle East and North Africa, none of whom the people in Europe now want and would like to expel. Sweden in particular has gone from being one of the safest places in the world to being the rape capital of Europe.
Wow.
It's a catastrophe. There's nothing right about anything happening in Europe. So if you're on the verge of being thrown out of office, and I think all those governments are on very shaky ground, what do? Well, I think Hermann Göring at the Nuremberg trials summed it up very well. You create enemies, you create threats that are not existent. But if your media is compliant, and at the time, of course, the German media was an arm of the state, and effectively all of the media in the West is some way or another an arm of globalism. In other words, the global concept of life, which is striving for global governance and effectively reducing everyone to a willing, mindless consumer who will do whatever he's told, whether it's to take vaccinations or eat bugs or whatever. And all of these people are about the same thing. Well, they're in trouble. It's not going down well in Europe. The Europeans don't like it. And so you create this myth that somehow or another the Russians are interested in going further to the West. Now, here's a quickie that your audience needs to know. Sikorsky, who's the current Polish foreign minister, is married to Anne Applebaum, who is probably one of the leading neocon globalist maniacs on the scene, who has been beating the drums for perpetual war with Russia, much like Victoria Nuland and the Kagans and the rest of these characters. So anything he says is essentially a function of channeling Anne Applebaum and her friends. I don't think this Polish government is going to make it over the long term at all. I think they'll be gone in a few months because they're not dealing with any of the real problems that beset Poland. And I think the Polish population has grown tired of this nonsense about Russia is coming and is going to kill everybody, because it hasn't happened and they know it won't. And the only reason that the Russians are not already halfway to the Polish border without having already crossed the Dnieper River is they don't want to go. They're not interested in that. Nobody in Moscow wants to rule anybody who's not a Russian. That's why they're hoping that they can end this war and essentially consolidate what is the historically Russian portion of Ukraine, annex it, make it part of Russia, and call it a day. But to do that, they have to have a government that accepts neutrality. So the Swedes in particular are bizarre, because he's right. They've had 210 days of peace, and suddenly they decide to throw all of that overboard and join NATO. Same thing with NATO is a crumbling edifice. There's nothing behind it. There's great discontent in NATO. People want an end to this nonsense in Eastern Europe, and they want to deal with their own problems, which includes expelling as many of these unwanted migrants in their country as they can get rid of. So
it seems like
these are the realities.
It seems like to really to bolster what you just said about the media being used to kick up this fear that Russians are coming. There was a so-called leaked German report that made the news here that showed this. I think it was called 9 Steps to World War III. And all these big arrows flown around and hundreds of thousands of troops doing all this kind of stuff and big fists in the middle. Looks really scary. All that red on there. What do you make of this, Doug?
Well, it's Fantasy Island. This is the sort of thing that people in Washington love, and it's being disseminated to their vassal states in Europe. The Russians, first of all, don't have the forces for such an offensive, nor do they want them. I mean, there are limits to what the Russians want to spend and invest in defense. I wish we had limits, but they do. Putin wants to do business with Western Europe, not go to war with it. Again, this is part of the fiction that the Germans and everyone else has to stay in a permanent state of hostility to Russia, which is what we want. I'm surprised they didn't include some Chinese component. And of course, the laughable statement is about, oh, well, they're using North Korean missiles. Well, Russians don't need North Korean missiles. North Koreans were anxious to sell those. The Russians took them. But they're Russian knockoffs. The North Koreans didn't develop these from scratch. They're just a version of what the Russians have already got. This is all nonsense. But the Europeans need to wake up, and I think they are gradually. You've seen the unrest in Germany, which is very unusual for Germans, and also in the Netherlands. I think you'll see more of it, and ultimately, I think you'll see some in Poland. I don't know what the Swedes will do, but thus far they've been very fine sheep, and they're marching wherever they're told to go. But I have friends in Sweden and Finland, and they're looking at what's happening up along the Arctic Circle, seeing Americans arrive with equipment and technology. They're beginning to figure out, well, wait a minute, why are they here? Again, everything we are doing is designed to provoke Russia. We want to provoke them. The good news for us is that the Russians have said no thank you and have exercised incredible restraint. I think they will continue to do so.
Yeah, and that restraint is very often, as we've had on a couple of recent episodes. We had George Beebe on, actually, who says he thinks that a lot of the what Russia is shown as restraint and taking a longer view is being misinterpreted in the West as being incapacity, that Russia can't do a lot of these things. And therefore, that gives reason for people. And we're going to show a couple of things here in a row because it's just really kind of embarrassing in my view. You have Zelensky, the Swiss foreign minister, and Biden kind of looking like they're not connected to reality, but the Russians are, as we'll see in a second. But first of all, here's what Zelensky's saying. Here's what he thinks is really going on the ground.
Ukraine's defense industry is not just recovering, it is becoming as productive as it needs to be for a modern, technology-driven warfare. For the next year, we have set ourselves crystal clear goals in terms of artillery, drones, missiles, and armored vehicles. One of our major political results this year is an agreement with our partners, particularly the United States, on co-production of weapons.
You know, we used to have I remember when you and I were both serving, Doug, there was a popular thing going through the military that hope is not a strategy. You can't do that, which was kind of like, well, duh, yeah, no kidding. But here in this current age right now, that seems to be not even an embarrassing, yeah, that's what it is. And listen to the Swiss foreign minister say exactly that.
We have to give a future. We need to give hope. And we have to encourage the Ukrainian population to imagine their future. That it is our duty and it is our interest to do this, because if they lose hope, they're no longer going to fight. If they're no longer going to fight, the geopolitical consequences will be major, and they are not in our interest. So there's a real spin behind this.
And I don't know if you noticed the dais there where he was speaking. It's they're promoting the so-called peace formula for Ukraine, which is, hey, even though we're kind of on the backside of this war and all the advantages are in Russia, we want them to surrender to us. So that's our hope. I mean, what do you make of that disconnect from what's on the ground in reality?
It's part of the larger ideology that rests on a foundation of wishful thinking and unrealistic expectations. I'm beginning to think that Fantasy Island is a place where there's endless room for crazies and deluded individuals. The Swiss foreign minister is obviously one of the pack. Ukraine is finished. It's done. And again, the Russians can press on, and they are pressing gradually further and further west. And at this pace, I suspect they're going to end up along the Dnieper. And then the question is, if there's no one willing to negotiate an end to this travesty, they'll cross the river and go further. This is not something they want to do. It's a reality. We have nothing with which to stop them, unless, of course, you want to use a nuclear weapon. And that would be the end of civilization as we know it, because their nuclear arsenal is equal to or larger than our own. We have Russian submarines up and down the Atlantic and even in the Pacific. They can all launch missiles and incinerate our cities within the space of an hour or so. So that's all crazy nonsense. This is designed for the domestic audience. Stir up fear, and if you stir up enough fear, perhaps you can remain in office, and perhaps then you can sort through all the other problems to continue converting us into globalized sheep. It's not going to work. It's just a dead end. And George Beebe is someone who knows what he's talking about. He's got a good grasp of the situation. He's absolutely right. This is very sad. It's sad when you watch your government behave like Bolsheviks and Soviet communists, lying through their teeth about everything that you can imagine. Remember, we're bankrupt, and the Europeans are not far behind, and some of them are out ahead of us. So if you're bankrupt, what are you going to do? I guess this is the last straw.
Speaking of our government doing exactly what you said, here is Biden saying what he thinks is going to happen if we don't stop Russia.
The entire world is watching. What will the United States do? And think if we don't support Ukraine, what's the rest of the world going to do? What's Japan going to do, which is supporting Ukraine now? What's going to happen in terms of the G7? What's going to happen in terms of our NATO allies? What are they going to do? If we walk away now, it'll only embolden other would-be aggressors. So I'm calling on Congress to do something and do the right thing, to stand with the people of Ukraine, stand against the tyranny of Putin, stand for freedom, literally stand for freedom. Let's get this done.
What's just anguishing to me, Doug, as I listen to that, is just so divorced from reality on the ground, is that he's still, this is my aspiration. This is what I want to happen. I want Russia to lose. I want Ukraine to win. And so I'm just going to keep moving in that direction. We have to keep going, even though everything on the ground screams that that's not going to happen. And then that is even more anguishing. You just said it's embarrassing that we seem to be doing what the Bolsheviks were doing in the past. Now that I see the Russians, though, they're saying things that seem to be pretty grounded in reality. Here's what Shoigu says. Here's how he views the current situation.
За прошедший год потери противника превысили 215 тысяч человек и 28 тысяч единиц вооружения. Мы сохраняем стратегическую инициативу на всей линии боевого соприкосновения. Несмотря на истощение людского ресурса украинских формирований и отсутствие результатов на поле боя, Соединенные Штаты Америки хладнокровно пытаются реализовать свои амбиции на мировое лидерство за счет жизни украинцев. С подачи западных кураторов киевский режим продолжает гнать на убой своих солдат и ищет любые возможности для восполнения рядов украинской армии. Безусловно, это не изменит ситуацию на линии боевого соприкосновения, а только затянет военный конфликт. Продолжим последовательно достигать целей специальной военной операции.
So I think that's a pretty good assessment. The Ukraine side, they're just sending people into a meat grinder with no chance of change in the end. The United States just keeps funding enough that keeps it alive, but it's never going to change the outcome of it. And Russia is looking not to conquer Western Europe, not to start World War III like that German map showed, but they just want to go probably up to the Dnieper, as you suggested, and they want to put peace on their western border. And that seems something that's logical. They have a plan to get there. They have the internal capacity to do it, both manpower and with their industrial capacity and the human capital. They're getting 14,000 per month to volunteer, Doug. They don't have to mobilize people, whereas the Ukraine side's grabbing them off the street, and all they're doing is throwing them to the death, and it's not going to change the outcome.
Well, the Ukrainians aren't even keeping up with the losses. It's a trickle in terms of replacements. It's not just that they don't have anybody, but a lot of people are hiding, avoiding service, so they're relying on old men and boys. You sent it to me, and I'm sure many of your viewers have seen this, the former Ukrainian or current Ukrainian prosecutor general, I can't remember his name, Yuri something, and my command of Slavic languages is terrible. And he came on Ukrainian television just about 10 days ago and said it's time to tell the Ukrainian people the truth. We've lost 500,000 men dead. Hello. That's not a fictional figure. It's real. And then he says, well, we have to tell people the truth so that they'll provide more manpower. Well, that's not going to happen. There's a snowball's chance in hell of anybody saying, sure, let me go forward and die on that front. Yeah. Makes no sense at all. And again, the Russians have never wanted to kill large numbers of people. Keep in mind, they could have turned most of Ukraine into some facsimile of Gaza.
Yeah.
We know what's happening in Gaza. That's not what Putin wants to do in Ukraine at all. He wants the opposite. He wants to end this. He wants to get back to business. And by the way, and you have some experience with this because of your own past life, the Russian people are not interested in fighting in perpetuity. They're not interested in war for war's sake.
Right.
They have a say. Public opinion in Russia does matter. So they're happy with what he's done thus far because he's minimized casualties on his side and he's driven back the forces that they rightly know were aimed at Russia. But now they too would like an end to this. There's just no willingness on our side to do it. But it may be that we are all on the verge of financial bankruptcy and our economies are going to implode long before anything else happens, in which case everything will grind to a halt because nobody can afford to field the kinds of forces that were shown in that diagram. And there's no real reason to do so. So,
Right.
Judy,
There's no reason to.
No. I mean, it's Fantasy Island, but at some point, if you watched Fantasy Island years ago, reality steps in at the end of every story. And that's the way the story ends. Reality is going to step in, and this will stop.
So and here's my concern, and how do you see this playing out there? Because I mean, at some point, spin runs its course, and reality does impact on it, and it supersedes the spin no matter what. And so, at some point, you can't just give the fiction anymore. And that may be if at some point the Ukrainian army somewhere literally crumbles and collapses, and there's maybe a big movement somewhere. Or it remains a methodical move to the best where the casualties just keep flying up until eventually they don't have enough to replace it. But then the question is going to come in, what will the U.S. do? What will some of these like Poland, Sweden, some of these others do if they can no longer keep up that the war is going to go on? Do they do something stupid where it could precipitate a clash between the U.S. and Russia? Or will they just say, okay, now we surrender to reality, and now we're going to try to make a settlement and get the thing done? I hope that happens, but I fear that we could get stupid.
Well, we don't have to get there. We're already there, Dan. The people that are running our government are a combination of arrogance and ignorance. They don't understand the world they live in because they've created this fictional world where everything is moving in a direction that suits them. I don't like to use this old Leninist term, but it makes sense. It's called the correlation of forces. If you look at the correlation of forces, economics, political interests, military power, technology, all the issues that make up national power, if you will, or the power of any international organization, the correlation of forces has shifted decisively against us and West Europeans. The world has changed. All you have to do is look at BRICS, look at the expansion of what was originally Brazil, South Africa, Russia, China, India. It's now rapidly expanding. And I think it'll end up probably being as large as 30, 40, 50 nations. People are not doing business with dollars. And people always said, well, that's impossible. You can't do international business with dollars. But the Indians and the Russians and the Chinese are doing it. Even the Japanese and the Chinese avoid the use of dollars in their internal trade, and they trade in their own currency. So our financial hegemony is ending. Our military hegemony is over. We don't have the wherewithal or the power to do any of the things that Biden and his friends want to do. There's nothing in Europe. Their armies are a joke. I talk about the Lilliputian British army. The French aren't far behind. A friend of mine in the French army says the only thing the French army is prepared to do is go on safari in Africa. We've built these boutique forces that were designed for use during the Cold War against weak enemies. That era is ended. Technology has proliferated. So when you talk about Iran or Turkey or any number of different countries, there's a tendency in the West to say, well, those are backward states. No, they're not. They're very sophisticated. They have their own defense industries, or their missile inventories are astonishing.
Right.
We're facing a different world. Russia has already demonstrated that it was by no means this economic backwater that had no capability to withstand sanctions or American-supported military power in Ukraine. It's all nonsense. We're unwilling to come to terms with reality because if you do, you have to admit failure.
Now, here's one thing. Here's one thing that might possibly be used to bring a little sanity into it, and I want to get your views on this. And that is the fact that Biden now has, we got a presidential election coming up here shortly, and the last thing he can afford is to be seen as a loser and a failure in here. Is there the possibility that he can use the issue with Ukraine and say, well, those darn Republicans, they blocked all the money, so that's why Ukraine's losing. So let's just shut it off and move on to somewhere else and not press the issue further and actually allow the funding to stop so that it just hastens the end. It doesn't cause it because it's already irreversible in my view, but maybe that will stop us from going further. How do you see the election playing into Biden's actions?
Well, I don't see much difference between the Republicans and the Democrats. If you bothered to look at this ridiculous paper that was produced in the House of Representatives by Republicans called Plan for Victory in Ukraine, that's an exercise in fantasy. It has no chance of success.
I actually missed that, but yeah.
You can see it. It's absurd. Again, a lot of these people have been drinking their own Kool-Aid too long. And remember, I said arrogance and ignorance. Well, most of these people in the House are ignorant of reality. They don't understand the world they live in. It's fundamentally different. We are no longer the center of the universe. And if we were, it was for a relatively short period of time.
Yeah.
We're just a leading power. We're not the only one. We have advantages in some areas and we have disadvantages in others, but we are by no means this unchallengeable superpower. But people in Washington all live permanently in 1991.
And Doug, we don't need to be this unchallenged. We can have a great life and a great economy and a great security, just acknowledging what you just said there without having to say, no, I want to go back to 1995 or something. No, you can't. So let's don't try it, and let's just take our advantages and benefit from them. Isn't that right?
Well, I think you're right, but you've got people in Washington who want to continue to meddle in the affairs of other countries. They are very much like the Bolsheviks. They think they have a monopoly on truth and therefore should exercise power in behalf of the American people to do what they know in their hearts has to be done. They see themselves as being on the right side of history. I see themselves as standing in front of an enormous herd of giant buffalo and about to be trampled into dust, but they don't see it that way. And so they're saying, no, those big buffalo are no threat to us. After all, we have our own buffalo, and there are 3 buffaloes standing behind us, and they're not going anywhere. Look, we can't recruit for the armed forces. We are a terribly divided country. We don't have any societal cohesion. People say to me all the time, Doug, you talk about the American people. Who are they? We have millions of people in this country that we don't know where they came from. Well, we do, but we don't know anything about them. There's no evidence that they came here to become Americans. Tens of thousands of Chinese are now pouring in. And everybody said, oh, well, that's a 5th column. Well, a lot of those people were criminals in China. They were people that the government was after for corruption charges and other things. A lot of them are just single men that had no future in China. So, what do? Well, pack your bags. You're going to the United States. And if you can go over there, we get enough Chinese in the United States, they'll reproduce. And in 20 years, America will look like China. I mean, this is insanity, what we've done to ourselves. And there's no understanding on the Hill at all of just how serious it is. Now, sure, you can point to 1 or 2 people with a brain who can figure it out, but not many. And there are people on both sides of the aisle that can't agree on a lot of these things. So, Ro Khanna is one that has agreed with a lot of the things that you get on the other side from Marjorie Taylor Greene. And of course, people are critical of her because she simply says what she thinks, and she happens to be right. She may not always be perfectly articulate, and she may not have all the requisite degrees from Harvard and Yale and so forth. But as I tell people all the time, thermometers have degrees, and you know where you stick those. So we need common sense. We need leadership. We need character in government. I don't see any of it in sufficient numbers to rescue this country from inevitable bankruptcy.
Well, because here are your leading voices. I'll just throw this one out there.
Without Iran, there are no Houthis. The Houthis are completely backed by Iran. I've been saying for 6 months now, hit Iran. They have oil fields out in the open. They have the Revolutionary Guard headquarters you can see from space. Blow it off the map.
Yeah, just blow it off the map. I mean, I didn't realize how easy it was. And man, bro, Iran, problem solved just like that. That is your leading voices in Washington right now.
Well, without Senator Graham, the United States would be a much healthier, happier, and more prosperous place. Let's get that up front. He's just saying what his donors are telling him to say. You've got to look at the people that have the money. Where do they put it? What do they want? Well, it's clear they want open borders. It's also clear they want a war with Iran. So he's not the Lone Ranger by any means. And people have been conditioned over decades. Oh, it's Iran, it's Iran, it's Iran. Then you start to ask them questions. They don't know anything about Iran. They don't know anything about the people in it. The Houthis were there long before Iran was even remotely interested. And the Houthis only turned to Iran because they couldn't find anybody else to help them arm themselves against the Saudis and ISIS. We were on the side of the Saudis and ISIS in the war in Yemen. We finally discovered we'd created a disaster, a humanitarian disaster. Hundreds of thousands of people were starving to death. Finally, sobriety set in and we ended this thing, and so did the Saudis. And now the Saudis won't have anything to do with us in our attempts to harm the Houthis. The other thing is, remember, in the Middle East, all of these so-called militias or proxies, they're Arabs. They are going to support the people in Gaza come hell or high water because they are Muslim Arabs.
Yeah.
Hamas, Hezbollah, the militias in Iraq, the Houthis, they're all Arabs. Iran did not stand up and say, "Verily I say unto you, my children, attack." No, they don't have to say a word.
Yeah, they don't have to.
And, we've been very dumb by attacking the Houthis. All we've done is turn the Red Sea into a war zone and put an end to commercial shipping through the Red Sea and into the Suez. This is ridiculous nonsense. We and the Israelis together are escalating. Next step is Hezbollah. Things are winding down in Ukraine. The people there have suffered enough. Millions have left the country. Millions are living in abject poverty and despair. They want an end to this war. This criminal regime that Zelensky has is anti-Christian, anti-common sense, and is designed to destroy Ukraine and as much of the Russian military as it can. It's failed miserably in terms of its fights against Russia. Russia's is stronger now today than it's been since the 1980s. Right. But Ukraine is in ruins. It's finished. And we are complicit in that. Now we are trying to start another war down in the Middle East. And we are simply following blindly behind Mr. Netanyahu. And I predict the next step is Hezbollah. If you can't win in Gaza, and the Israelis have not, it has not worked, then what do? Well, you turn on Hezbollah. And then you hope that it drags us in. And then you get your war with Iran, or so people hope. And I'm sure that Senator Graham will be in the forefront. And he will forget completely about Ukraine. Look at the people who suddenly turned around in 1974, 75, and you would say, well, look what happened in Vietnam. And they'd say, Vietnam? Vietnam, what's that?
Right.
It just passed from the scene. Ukraine will pass from the scene. All of this hot air will go nowhere. It's tragic, but this is the history of our country. We need new government, new people, new blood, fresh thinking. We're not going to get that from these status quo parties. I don't see evidence for it anywhere, sadly.
So even if I was going to ask if President Biden was asking your opinion on what he should do. I'm sure you have a good answer there, but the real issue is no matter what you're about to say, who is there to execute it? Because whether you're talking about at the Pentagon, State Department, or in the White House, or anybody who wants to get in there right now, I'm just not sure that there's the human capital necessary to put into effect anything that you would say. But still, I want to know, what do you think we should do right now, given both the situation in Europe and to try to prevent a fireball from blowing up in the Middle East? What should we do right now?
Well, keep in mind that the bureaucracies are all entropic, and the people that we're hearing from are all third-tier, fourth-tier talents who know nothing but what they've learned in graduate school and what they're being told by their donors. So you're not hearing anybody who's speaking intelligently, rationally. No one is well informed. I hate to be blunt about it. I would just write them all off. So what do you tell President Biden? Check into senior living as soon as possible. That would be the best thing.
I guess that's step one.
Yeah. As for the rest of the government, I see no good news in Washington from anybody. Now, when you look at the candidates that are out there, and I feel great affection for President Trump. I always have, and I like him very much. I'm very concerned about the people that surround him. And I'm worried that could once again subvert him if he were to win the election and become president. I like RFK Jr. I think he's a very decent, honorable man who's trying to find his way forward. But all of them tend to, unfortunately, default too much to the status quo in foreign and defense policy, and particularly on too many issues here at home. So I just don't hold out much hope. I'm a believer in what I call the third way. That's why, I've joined OCOC, Our Country, Our Choice. I think we need a third way. I actually would welcome the development of a third party. We've got to get
Here,
new
here.
people. And when somebody says, who would you bring to Washington? I'd say anybody other than people from the Ivy Leagues or the service academies. I would bring in people from the rest of the country. Well, what if they have no experience? Well, experience is overrated, my God.
Exactly. If you have experience in the wrong thing, that's not good.
Experience has almost done us in. And that's why, dump this obsession with degrees from the Ivy League and the service academies, dump the assumptions about this is our best talent. If that's the best, we are doomed. There's no future for us.
Right. It's time to change the guard. Yeah. So I'm 100% in agreement with you. Very enthusiastic about what you're doing. I'm so grateful for Our Country, Our Choice. And I could not be more encouraging of all of our listeners to continue to support, your movement there. Because I agree, Doug, whether it's R or a D, I just don't see much difference in how they actually operate besides yelling at each other all the time. We need a new way before it's too late. And we just hope that that it's not too late. And I don't know that it's not.
Well, you're right. We're actually on the edge. We're peering into the abyss. Some people I'm sure have told you, well, we're the new Weimar Republic. We're on the edge of all sorts of bad decisions. Under those circumstances, I hope that we sober up and use our heads, because Lloyd Austin, and I'm by no means a fan, deserves credit that at least behind the scenes, he has periodically tried to remind everybody that he's talking to, including the president, that our resources are limited. We're overstretched. We're overreaching. Why are we doing what we're doing? We can't wage war on multiple fronts. We can't even wage a major regional war on one front right now.
I agree. Yeah.
So this sort of thing, at least he said that, and I give him credit for it. But he's pretty much the Lone Ranger. I don't know where Burns falls in on this, the CIA director. I lost confidence and trust in him a long time ago, because he's always known better. No one has stood up, and he's the first man that should have stood up and said, if you're going to do this, I'm out. But nobody wants to be out. Everybody wants to be on the A-list for cocktail parties inside the Beltway. Everybody has his hand out for cash. This has got to end, or the nation won't survive.
I think I think that we're in that position right now. But Doug, we continue to support you and Our Country, Our Choice. Keep going with all that, because at least there is one avenue for actual hope, unlike some of these false hopes that have been listed before here. And we'll just continue to see how things play out. But thanks for joining us today, Doug. And we'll look forward to having you back on very soon.
Sure. Thank you, Dan.
And thank you guys for watching too. And remember, like and subscribe and share this to everybody. I'm telling you, folks, you are hearing the truth here. You're hearing things here you're not getting anywhere else. And other people need to hear what you just heard here. Share this with your friends. We will be back later this afternoon at 2 p.m. with John Mearsheimer. We're going to get some more of the truth that you have come to expect from Daniel Davis Deep Dive. Thanks, and we'll see you next episode at 2 o'clock.